This is a small part of a much larger topic when dealing with translations. And look, I'm no linguist. I'm a bit of a language nerd, but I mean, nerd is the most you can say. I don't have any formal training in the realm of language and linguistics, and I don't speak any other languages. I have just developed a toolkit to learn how to research things. And when we're talking about Asian martial arts, but we happen to be in the US, and others are in the UK, Australia, other places in Europe and whatnot, we end up having to deal with translation because most of us are not going to be learning the native language in order to accommodate the system. Now, I will say this, one of the things that we have to be careful of is it almost never appears that that people in the original systems were trying to create a codified set of terminology. It was more like they were just communicating with one another. And that is something to be aware of. We don't want to make too much out of terminology just because it might sound cool or whatever. So we do have to be careful there. However, in the Wing Chun world in specific, we are one of the few systems that I've seen at least that has kind of quibbling over spelling even in the system name itself. Now, in northern systems where they are typically using the Mandarin dialect, the translation system now is Pinyin, whereas before it was Wade-Giles. Now, you still would have kind of your homegrown, for lack of a better term, personal translations. Basically, people trying to phonetically sound things out to the best of their understanding when translating things. And that is going to persist no matter what. When people are not educated in direct translation, when people just kind of learn organically, they lack a formal systematization. And while you can say on the one side, hey, good for them being able to communicate an idea without a formal system, but on the other side, you have issues with, down the line, it makes things harder to look up when there is a formalized system because personal translations aren't the ones that get written down into textbooks and translation guides and whatnot. So you end up with some serious difficulty. Hell, if you go back and look at old English texts from the 1700s and 1600s, some of the spellings are quite wildly different. If you go and read Chaucer, like an actual, not a transcription, with modernized spelling, but an actual original document, the spellings are sometimes extremely difficult to read. And some of that is just because languages tend to get standardized and formalized after the fact, not as they're growing up. And the same thing is true with our terminology. So when we're talking about Wing Chun, there's kind of three common spellings that you're going to come across. There are a few other, a few others that are kind of wacky, and we're not going to get into those here. But generally speaking, you're going to see Wing Chun just spelled how it sounds. It's a truly phonetic spelling based on how it sounds. And then you have, now keep in mind, they're all pronounced Wing Chun. They're not pronounced differently. There are tonal inflections from the Cantonese that I'm not 100% certain on. Again, I don't speak Cantonese, so I haven't bothered with that. But again, you have the Wing Chun spelled Wing, T-S-U-N. And that just sounds like somebody saying Chun with a lisp. And that spelling is actually very particular to the Lungting organization. I believe they even have that trademarked or copyrighted or something at this point. And then you have it spelled V-I-N-G-T-S-U-N, which is used by the Hong Kong Athletic Association, more or less the Yip Man Wing Chun headquarters. And the fact is that these are all just kind of phonetic attempts to spell a non-English word. This is called Romanization, right? Translating something from a non-English alphabet into the English alphabet, or a standard, European style alphabet. And so essentially, none of these are actually correct if you go to the linguistics. Now, I've heard people say, well, the TSUN is more correct to how the phonetics sound, to how the Chinese say it. I don't know. I've been around Sigung Kwok, who's a native Cantonese speaker, and it doesn't sound like he's saying Chun with a lisp. So I'm not sure about that one. And with the V, that's more like pronouncing the V as a W, right? Go back to Star Trek. Look, I know Chekhov, Walter Koenig wasn't actually Russian. He was just putting on an accent. But sometimes Russians do pronounce words that have a V in them with more of a W sound. And Slavic languages tend to have some trouble with that just because of the construction of the Cyrillic alphabet and all that. And then also in Latin, the V was pronounced as a W, right? So when Julius Caesar said Veni Vidi Vici, he didn't say Veni Vidi Vici, he said Veni Vidi Vici. I took Latin in high school, and yeah, that was one of the most hilarious things that I learned when I took Latin class. So the V as a W is really just kind of more like an old world Eastern European kind of thing. And that actually kind of brings us into the translations. So the actual translations that would be used in a formal translation system, in a formal Romanization system, we kind of have two heavy hitters. There isn't really a global standard, but we have two really solid heavy hitters for English Romanization, and that is Jyutping and Yale. Yale is in the university. So as you can see, they disagree a little bit on how they Romanize, and that's consistent throughout. The Yiping one, even with the pronunciation of the J as a Y sound, you can tell is a little bit more European, and their spellings tend to favor a slightly more European, maybe even a Slavic or Nordic type of translation of these phonemes. And so theirs, we pretty much are stuck with wing as correct. So the V-I-N-G is never correct. So we're stuck with kind of the W-I-N-G. That's fine. But then we have C-E-O-N, right? Because C is kind of a redundant letter in English, right? We have K and S to do the job of the hard and soft sounds. But then we're still left with the ch sound, the CH kind of sound. And that's where, like in Pinyin, they use the Q for that sound, because there's Q is another one that's kind of redundant. We have K, we have W. So there's no reason to have the Q by itself. So the Q as a CH kind of works for the Pinyin system, and it causes all sorts of confusion, and thus so many people pronounce Chun as Quan because they don't understand these Romanization systems. So here we have the C as a ch sound, and then you still have the E-O-N. So this more kind of this elongated eon kind of sound, though it's never, I mean, again, I've listened to Chinese people, native Cantonese speaking people say this, and it never has that fully elongated sound. It's kind of just kind of tucked in there as it's not quite just an grunt. There's a little bit more to it, right? And then when you look at the Yale is much more favorable to Americans, and to a degree even British English, Australian English, just because we have kind of our own method of saying things. And granted, you have the rhotic versus non-rhotic, and you have regional dialects and stuff, right? But the fact is that this is more recognizable with the ch sound being spelled out. And so when I translate the characters, I will always double check with my Yale and Yiping sources. I tend towards the Yale because it is easier for an English speaking audience. The Yiping is preferred in Hong Kong, which is funny because they were a British territory for so long. You'd think that they would go more towards like the British English or American English side rather than kind of like the Eastern European side, but I digress. So yeah, in Yale or in Hong Kong, they tend to use the Yiping. I won't say that they tend to use the Yale here in the US. To my knowledge, most people are not translating from Cantonese much at all. And oftentimes when I do see Cantonese translated, it's almost always just whatever the individual or local phonetics are, and not a fully used system. The thing with using these though is you can look these up. You can actually go and find translators online that use these romanization systems so that you can get the tones and the spellings and everything standardized, so that when you type in a character and you get the English pronunciation and the English translation, they match up consistently. And that's what's important here. So now I'm not going to tell you not to use these, right? I still use the phonetic Wing Chun because it is the common spelling that kind of everybody uses, the general English-speaking audience uses. It is more common than the other two. So it's more recognizable, and because we tend to have to let custom take precedent for the sake of clarity, unless it's just outright wrong, we tend to use this. And because it is literally only one letter off, I figure it's no big deal. I can always put this in a formal guide if I need to write something down. But for videos and social media posts and whatnot, I will just write this. It's fine. Now, as far as the second one goes, again, that's specific to Lung Ting's organization, and I'm certain I'm pronouncing his name more or less wrong. I'm sure that there's a little bit of nuance in the way his name is pronounced as well. But the fact is that, you know, while the Wing is consistent, this TSUN just doesn't have any basis in the language guides. And while it is common enough, and if you're part of his organization, just go ahead and spell it that way, right? It's your thumbprint, it's your calling card. You might as well just consider it a trademark at this point, because it functionally serves no other purpose other than being a trademark for his brand of Wing Chun. And then this one we have to keep around just because the Hong Kong Wing Chun Athletic Association has, you know, started and continued to use this since they've been translating things into English. And so that being the case, we're kind of stuck with that too. So we basically have 3 incorrect romanizations because they have seated themselves culturally, when the actual linguistic romanizations through, you know, formal guidelines will differ to some degree. Now, at the end of the day, does it really matter? As long as people understand what you're saying and communicating with, no, it doesn't matter that much. But as somebody who likes to see language be clear and concise and not obfuscated by a million private meanings, right? There's a whole logic argument about private language and it basically being fundamentally useless because it prevents you from being able to communicate anything. We have to be careful about using too many private, individual, or local versions of words, because the fact is that only stays in that one little bubble, and outside of that bubble, if the entire exterior to that bubble uses a certain convention, then you're the odd duck out that's going to have trouble communicating with the rest of them. And so we have to be careful about our communication. Now, in this case, right, these are all recognizable. You may get into a little bit of friction over these, but for the most part, it's not that big of a deal. When we get into some of the other terminology, though, it can start to be a bigger deal, because a lot of times the translations, what we use for certain techniques and principles, have, you know, there are slang meanings which are actually important to understand, and then there are formal meanings, and then understanding that, you know, terminology is not always codified formal lexicon, but sometimes just natural communication. It is very easy to get into trouble with things. So it is, in my opinion, it is very important to be as precise and accurate with our language as possible, while not coming across so, you know, heads up our own asses about being better than other people for having more accurate translations. It's more of a fact that it's just better to use accurate translations and romanizations, you know, have things written down, have a succinct have your quick and dirty broad stroke version that maybe doesn't capture all the nuance but communicates enough, and then also somewhere at least have it recorded and plain to search the full nuanced definitions of what you're talking about, and be willing to explain that when questions arise. Because again, clear and concise communication is really, really important. Now, we don't want our martial arts practice to devolve into a linguistic rap battle. That's not what we want this to turn into. If you have time to translate, you have no business fighting anyway. You're not going to have time to translate in a real fight. So it's not the most important thing in the world. I mean, for all I care, you could do like Kempo did and just rename everything in English, and you'd be just as well off as long as the communication was clear and concise. Just so happens that in our case, some of the Cantonese terminology is shorter than trying to say it in English, because it gives a one word for something that would be a paragraph of explanation in English. So using the Cantonese is useful. And this is true if you're doing stuff in Mandarin, doing stuff in Japanese, doing stuff in another language. Sometimes the native word is actually better than the English translation, carries a certain nuance and depth to it that just would take too much to describe in English. So sometimes you're just better off. Sometimes we have an English proxy word that means more or less the same thing, and you can use that too. And it's important to just be clear and concise about what you're doing. So hopefully that clears that up. As another interesting point here, traditionally speaking, Yip Man's name, man would be about the same in these translation standards, but you would actually spell Yip Man Y-I-P, Yip. And listening to Sigum Kwok say it, it's almost like there's a shadow of a Y on the beginning of it. It's not truly Yip Man, but it's not Yip Man either, right? It's not the onomatopoeia of a dog yipping. It's not that either. There's just like a hint of a Y, a LaCroix of a Y on the beginning of that I sound, Yip Man. And so there's a little bit of something there. But the reason that we spell it IP is because on Yip Man's actual license or photo ID that he had in the 1950s, 1960s, he himself spelled it IP. That was his preferred or his chosen English romanization of his name. And so again, just like these being kind of just culturally ingrained, the man himself just spelled it IP. So let's be consistent with that. And he probably would have preferred we spell it out in Chinese characters. But the fact is that if we're going to spell it out in English, he himself wrote it as IP, so we write it as IP. Still pronounced Ip, pronounced Yip, but not Yip, but Ip, something like that, right? My Cantonese pronunciation is terrible. So there are a ton of words that we use as terminology and principles and techniques and whatnot that are generally speaking misspelled and quite frankly poorly translated. I've been through a couple of them, but I don't have any plans to do a systematic review over each of them on video. They'll just come out when they come out. So let's leave it there because I am in danger of rambling more than I already am. And I will talk to you guys later. Good journey. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. Share this with your friends or anybody else who might be interested in this kind of content. If you happen to be in the Metro Phoenix area, come in for a class or just stop in to say hi. We'd love to meet you. Definitely check out our socials and our website that has all of our contact information and all of the other relevant information. And more than anything, check out our Substack. Our Substack will be containing all of the links that we use to cite and reference in our videos, as well as exclusive training content that will be available for premium members. Memberships are cheap, but you can also sign up for free, and we do have articles for free, and we will have more free articles available for you. It is a fantastic platform for what we're doing here, and we hope to see you over there. So I will talk to you guys later, and look out for the next one. Good journey.